What would you do if you were asked to leave a VIP lounge just because you didn't look like someone who belonged there? No yelling, no confrontation, just a soft-spoken request, cold enough to slice through your dignity. That day, Flight DA-217 was scheduled to depart from Brookpine Terminal to Chicago. No one in the business class lounge knew. They were about to witness a quiet but seismic chain of events, one that would force the entire U.S. airline industry to rewrite itself from the ground up. The woman asked to leave the lounge wasn't famous. She wasn't rich in the way they'd recognize. There were no headlines defending her, no bodyguards, just a small carry-on, a calm smile, and a pair of eyes that had seen this kind of humiliation far too many times in her life. But exactly 1 minute later, a phone call was made, and 72 hours after that, the entire senior leadership system of Dawson Air was wiped clean. The truth is, they had just denied service to the very woman who built the airline. The afternoon rain poured down on Brookpine as if someone in the sky had finally unleashed a heavy, brooding storm that had been restrained all day. The first raindrops tapped gently against the airport lobby's glass panels like a quiet warning, but within moments they turned into millions of icy needles, cutting through expensive trench coats and glossy leather briefcases carried by the hurrying passengers entering the terminal reserved for the elite. Amidst the downpour, a woman appeared. No escort car, no assistant at her side, no umbrella, just herself, her slim heels tapping lightly on the wet concrete. That woman was Camille Dawson. People glanced at her, but no one paid much attention. With her short curly hair, a gray trench coat, and an old canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, Camille looked no different from an ordinary traveler who had mistakenly wandered into the VIP entrance. But no one knew that just hours earlier, she had delivered a keynote at a global summit in Geneva. And just a week before that, she had led the acquisition of 3 domestic airlines, elevating Dawson Air to the 3rd largest private aviation company in North America. Yet today, no one recognized her. That was how she wanted it. No bodyguards, no reporters, no spotlight. For this trip, Camille had booked her own ticket, carried her own luggage, and returned home, just like any ordinary passenger. She approached the glass door of the Brookpine Executive Terminal just as a middle-aged white couple stepped in ahead of her and were greeted with a warm smile. The lounge manager, a man named Trevor King, held the door open for them and bowed slightly. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Donnelly. The lounge is ready for you." But the moment Trevor's eyes landed on Camille, his expression shifted instantly. He stepped forward to block her path, his gaze a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone unwelcoming. "This entrance is for executive class passengers only. Please present your membership card or boarding pass." Camille offered a polite smile without reacting. She knew that look all too well. It didn't come from protocol, but from prejudice. She reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly folded boarding pass along with a sleek black elite membership card, the kind issued only to those who spend over $500,000 annually with Dawson Air. Our Trevor took it and held it up under the light, tilting and inspecting it as if it were counterfeit money. He frowned. "This card looks unfamiliar. I've never seen this design before." Camille calmly replied, "It's the new elite card design. Just updated this month. I believe it's valid." Trevor nodded, still eyeing her with doubt. "Even so, I'll need you to wait out here while I verify it with the system." Camille's voice remained composed. "May I wait inside? The rain's coming down hard." But Trevor pointed toward the drafty corridor. "Sorry, we need to maintain the privacy and experience of our VIP clients." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Without another word, Camille turned and stepped back outside. Wind-laced rain lashed at her face like a whip. Her coat grew heavier with each passing minute, soaked through. Her small-heeled shoes sank slightly into the scattered puddles on the airport pavement. Yet Camille remained composed. She stood there upright, not leaning on anything, her gaze fixed on the glass doors through which other guests were now being served wine and offered warm towels. From inside, Aisha Monroe, a young trainee behind the secondary check-in desk, saw everything. She froze. She had seen Trevor let at least 3 white men walk in without so much as checking anything. One had even forgotten his card, and Trevor had laughed. "No worries, I remember your face." But with that black woman, who had all the proper documents, he still insisted on suspicion and sent her into the rain. Aisha wanted to speak up, but she was just an intern, barely 3 months into the job. She looked down and pretended to shuffle some files. Outside, Camille stood still. No one knew the memories running through her mind. The time she was a student and someone called her the one in the wrong class among the gifted, or the day she signed her first $1 million deal, only to have a bank clerk ask, "Are you signing on someone else's behalf?" She had thought the times had changed, but today at the airport lounge she herself had signed off on back in 2017, she was the one being asked to wait in the rain. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 25 minutes. Camille stood there the entire time. More passengers arrived, each one greeted by Trevor, some even walking right past her, unaware that the soaked woman outside was someone they should probably know. At last, Trevor returned, his expression unchanged. "You may come in," he said, "since it's raining, but we'll be watching. Please don't do anything unusual." Camille nodded without a word. She stepped through the door, leaving wet footprints on the polished marble floor. The room was lit in a warm golden hue, the subtle scent of cedar wood in the air. But the atmosphere was far from welcoming. Every pair of eyes seemed to turn toward her, as if she didn't belong in that space. Trevor returned to the reception desk and whispered to a colleague, "Keep an eye on her. Let me know if anything weird happens." Camille heard every word, but she simply removed her coat, hung it neatly, took a dry towel to pat her hands, and sat in a leather chair in the corner. No one knew that this woman was the one signing their paychecks. She said nothing, showed no anger. But in Camille's eyes, a storm was gathering, not the one outside, but a cold, calculated fury from someone who had once built the very system now pushing her out. And what they didn't know was that this time, she wouldn't walk away in silence. Camille sat quietly in the farthest corner of the VIP lounge, not because she wished to avoid attention, but because she knew full well that the eyes around her would never look the same if she sat in the center. She knew that feeling all too well, the half-curious stares, the polite nods laced with suspicion, and most of all, the quiet understanding that someone like her didn't belong there. On the table in front of her sat a glass of untouched water, a now dry hand towel, and an abandoned in-flight magazine with the bold headline on its cover, "Reimagining Executive Travel, the Future of Private Aviation." Ironic, considering she had written the lead editorial in that very issue, yet now was being treated as if she weren't even worthy of a seat. Trevor, the lounge manager, still glanced her way every few minutes. The polite facade was gone. His gaze now resembled that of security staff monitoring a suspicious guest more than that of a concierge serving a distinguished client. Camille didn't care about the looks, but every detail was being recorded in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't quite ready to reveal. In the center of the lounge, the faint clinking of a spoon against an espresso cup echoed periodically. A male staff member approached a middle-aged man with graying hair and a navy blue suit, bowing slightly with a cheerful smile. "Mr. Ashford, your flight will depart in 40 minutes. If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." The man nodded slightly without looking up. Camille glanced over and recognized him, a loyal client she had personally invited to the launch gala for the Dallas-Vancouver route last year. He didn't recognize her, or perhaps he didn't care to look. Camille didn't remind him. She was used to being passed over like a shadow. At the main counter, Aisha Monroe, the young employee from before, was arranging documents. She cast a glance toward Camille, her eyes filled with quiet guilt. Aisha had seen it all. She had been there when Camille was asked to stand in the rain. And now, seeing her sit alone in this luxurious space, silently absorbing the stares of those who were supposed to serve her, Aisha felt something shift inside. But fear still held her back. In this world, someone young like her didn't speak up against a superior. Not when that superior was Trevor. Not when the guest didn't look like the usual kind of guest. Trevor made his way toward the center table, bent slightly to adjust a corner of the tablecloth, then pretended to check an electrical outlet near the wall, all just so he could sneak another glance at Camille without seeming rude. Camille hadn't moved an inch. She didn't pick up her phone, didn't open a laptop, didn't try to look busy or agitated. She just sat there, with a calmness so composed it made others uneasy, because confident silence always terrifies the insecure. From afar, the revolving door opened. A gust of cold air swept in. A new guest entered, a young white man wearing sunglasses, a turtleneck, and a brown leather jacket. Trevor turned at once and hurried toward him. "Welcome, Mr. Johnson. Would you like anything before your flight?" Camille gently closed her eyes. Johnson, she recognized the name, a guitarist who had once performed at a Dawson Air-sponsored event. He had even posted a photo with the CEO on Instagram not long ago. But as usual, he didn't recognize Camille. Or maybe he wasn't sure. Because the moment Camille stepped away from the polished CEO image, she seemed to become invisible. That fact spoke louder than any words. Camille opened her eyes. She checked the time. About 30 minutes remained until boarding. She stood up, retrieved her coat from the rack, wiped away the dried streaks of rain, and exited the lounge without a word. No one stopped her. No one asked anything. Trevor watched her go and sneered. "Guess she realized she doesn't belong here," he muttered, just loud enough for a colleague to hear, and chuckle. But Camille didn't need to stay and listen. She was walking toward the gate that led to the private tarmac, and right there, within minutes, her patience would be tested to its final limit. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, what matters is this: that lounge didn't not belong to Camille because she was unqualified. It never deserved her in the first place. Not because of the furniture, not because of the service, but because of how the people inside chose to see a modestly dressed black woman like her. The lounge that wasn't hers wasn't named so because she lacked the right credentials, but because prejudice had stripped away her right to belong the moment she walked through the door. But Camille Dawson was not the kind of woman who backs down in silence. She would let them reveal themselves one by one, bias by bias, using the simplest method of all, letting them speak their truth before they knew who she really was. And when they did, there would be nowhere left for them to hide. Camille stepped out of the lounge with a calmness that was unreadable. The rain had eased, leaving only fine mist clinging to the glass panels and the soaked tarmac leading toward Dawson Air's private jet terminal. The sky remained a dull gray, and the breeze carried the scent of jet fuel and damp asphalt. The engines of nearby aircraft hummed in the background, but none of those mechanical sounds could drown out the heavy silence that had taken root inside Camille. She walked steadily toward the staircase leading up to the plane. It was the Falcon 60, a silver-white private jet bearing the Dawson Air Wing logo, parked silently as though waiting for the one person it truly belonged to. But just as Camille set foot on the first step of the stairway, a sharp voice rang out from above. "Stop right there!" Camille looked up. A woman in her 30s, tall with neatly tied hair, stood at the aircraft door in a navy blue uniform that looked like it came straight from a corporate-style guide. Her name badge read, Heather Sloan, lead flight attendant. She didn't smile. She didn't greet. She just stood there like a gatekeeper. "This is a private aircraft. You're not allowed to board without proper authorization." Camille didn't respond right away. She stood silently, looking at Heather for a moment, then calmly pulled out her boarding pass and ID from her coat pocket. "I have all the necessary documents. I'm a passenger on this flight." Heather didn't take them. Her eyes scanned Camille from head to toe. The slightly damp trench coat, the simple heels, the short curly hair not styled to impress. No luxury watch, no designer handbag, no entourage. Heather raised an eyebrow and pressed her lips together with skepticism. "To be honest," she said slowly, each word slicing the air, "you don't look like the type of person who flies on aircraft like this. The commercial terminal is about a mile that way. You might have taken the wrong turn." Camille tightened her hand slightly but kept her voice composed. "I know exactly where I am, and I am fully authorized to board this plane." Heather let out a sharp, mocking laugh, not even trying to hide her disdain. "Do you know how much a flight like this costs? It's not less than $75,000. Not exactly a price point most people are familiar with." Camille continued to hold out her documents, but Heather didn't even glance at them. Just then, a familiar male voice came from behind. "Is there a problem here?" Trevor King approached from a distance, his suit slightly rumpled, hair tousled from the wind. Heather turned, her tone softening immediately upon seeing Trevor. "This woman is trying to board the jet without proper verification." Trevor looked at Camille and let out a sigh, as if relieved to find a lingering nuisance still unresolved. "You're still here? I thought you had left." Camille turned to face them both. Trevor on her right, Heather on her left, standing like two gatekeepers to a world they believed she had no right to enter. "I have my boarding pass, my ID, and this is my flight." "You could be faking it," Heather said quickly. "Anyone can make fake IDs these days." Trevor nodded in agreement, tilting his chin with a smug challenge. "We'll call security. This is a restricted area. Please leave before this escalates." Camille didn't back down. She slipped her documents back into her coat pocket and slowly pulled out her phone. "I'll ask just once more," she said, her tone still calm but now noticeably cold. "Are you absolutely sure you want to continue down this path? Because once I make this call, there's no going back." Heather burst out laughing. "Oh, wow. Jason, did you hear that? She's threatening us now." Trevor chuckled, pretending to be frightened. "Well then, go ahead. We'd love to see who you think you can call." Camille dialed. The phone rang. "Malcolm," she said when the line picked up, "I'm being stopped from boarding my own jet. A flight attendant and a manager at Brookpine are refusing to verify me as a passenger. I need this dealt with immediately." The space around them fell dead silent. Heather frowned. Trevor froze. Malcolm Dawson. That name was far from unfamiliar. The COO of Dawson Air. The man who signed off on top-level personnel decisions. The man who could restructure an entire division with one meeting. Camille ended the call. Her eyes no longer carried softness. It was the gaze of someone who had once stood before a board of directors, deciding the fate of a multi-million-dollar acquisition. "I gave you the chance not to make this mistake," she said, "but you were too caught up in your prejudice to see the truth." Heather stepped back slightly, her voice trying to retain control. "I don't care who you called. We follow protocol here, and protocol says no boarding without verification." Trevor jumped in, his voice tightening. "And if you don't leave this area now, I'll call airport security." Camille didn't move. Raindrops began to fall again, cold and sparse against her shoulders. But she didn't shield herself, didn't flinch. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering, and said one short sentence. "Check the passenger list. Immediately." Heather hesitated. Trevor hesitated. They looked at each other, and for a brief second, something flickered across their faces. Not quite fear, but doubt in themselves. Yet it still wasn't enough to make them act differently. Camille raised her phone again, this time her voice sharper. "Ryan, I need all surveillance footage at Brookpine from 3 p.m. to now. Recordings of my interactions with staff in the lounge, at the jet gate, and anyone present in the VIP area. Send it to Internal Affairs immediately." Trevor swallowed hard. Heather clenched her fists. Overhead under the gray sky, the Falcon LX remained still, like a silent witness waiting for the moment when all truths would come to light. And that moment was coming, very soon. The rain had stopped completely, but the pavement at Brookpine Executive Terminal remained dark and slick, as if holding on to the remnants of a storm that had passed but hadn't truly left. Camille stood there, not leaning against the door, not stepping back even half a step. Her phone was still in her hand, the screen glowing with a recent call history showing one name clearly, Malcolm Dawson. Trevor King and Heather Sloan were trying to maintain neutral expressions, but the tension in their clenched jaws, the way their arms stiffened behind their backs, and the uneasy glances they exchanged revealed that something was clearly slipping out of their control. Camille said nothing more. Her eyes were fixed on the far end of the tarmac, where two technicians were inspecting the engines of the Falcon LX. Inside her, there was no loud fury, only a cold stillness, the kind known only to those who have survived 100 silent battles that no one ever noticed. Inside the cabin, a few crew members had started whispering. One younger staffer near the window asked quietly, "Who is she? Why is she calling Malcolm directly?" Another shook his head, replying under his breath, "I don't know. But if she can call Malcolm, she's not just anybody." Meanwhile, Trevor pulled out his phone and began dialing airport security. But his fingers trembled slightly, and he misdialed once before clearing it and trying again. Heather no longer looked arrogant. She stepped back, arms crossed, eyes tracking Camille like she was trying to guess what would happen next. Camille already knew. Her call to Malcolm wasn't just a signal, it was leverage. And the only people who didn't realize that were the very ones who had just pushed themselves off a cliff. Heather's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her eyes darkening. She raised it to her ear, listened for a few moments, and nodded without saying a word. When she hung up, she didn't look at Camille. She looked at Trevor. "We've got an emergency meeting incoming. They're on their way." Trevor frowned. "Who's coming?" "I'm not entirely sure," but the voice on the other end was someone very high up. That answer didn't comfort Trevor. He turned back toward Camille, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes. But Camille wasn't looking at them anymore. She had turned toward Aisha Monroe, who had just stepped out from the operations area to check the boarding desk. Aisha met Camille's gaze and froze. The air stilled. In that brief moment, Aisha felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't dared feel since she first started this job. She walked toward Camille. Her voice trembled but remained clear. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I saw everything from the beginning. I should have spoken up sooner." Camille tilted her head, her eyes softening, not because Aisha apologized, but because she had stepped forward. Camille said gently, "Thank you. Sometimes all it takes is one person to see. Everything changes." But that moment didn't last long. Heather stepped in, her voice cutting like a blade. "Aisha, return to your station. This doesn't concern you." Aisha instinctively stepped back, but Camille moved between them. "Miss Sloan," Camille said slowly, "I'd advise you to choose your words carefully, because everything you just said is being recorded." Trevor scowled. "Recorded? By what?" Camille didn't answer. She lifted her phone and gave a clear command. "Ryan, activate voice recording from airport technical support systems. Any conversation related to incidents in the Brookpine VIP zone for the past 90 minutes, archive and encrypt under Level 1 Executive ID. Begin now." Through her earpiece, a soft automated voice responded, "Voice recording activated at 1726. Access confirmed. Camille Dawson, Executive Chairman authorization level. Activity now being recorded and archived." Heather stepped back completely. Trevor's mouth opened, but no words came out. Aisha stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief. Camille was no longer the silent woman who had walked into the lounge in a damp coat. She was something else, a presence none of them had prepared for, and one they couldn't fight. Just then, the sound of engines approached from the security gate. 3 sleek black SUVs rolled into the private terminal zone and came to a sharp halt. Doors opened in unison. From the lead vehicle, Malcolm Dawson stepped out, gray suit, deep blue silk tie, and eyes that carried zero patience. Behind him were 2 corporate legal advisors, Director of Security Ryan Hughes, and 2 senior members of Human Resources. Trevor backed away completely, his face pale. Heather stood frozen. Malcolm didn't stop walking. He went directly to Camille, glanced briefly at his sister to confirm she was unharmed, and then turned to face the staff gathered there. "I need everyone to be silent and listen carefully," Malcolm began. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of internal authority that halted all movement. "In the past 60 minutes, there have been at least 3 serious violations involving discrimination and obstruction of an executive passenger from boarding a company-owned jet. These actions have been recorded, on camera, through audio, and corroborated by witnesses." He turned to Camille. "Camille Dawson, chairwoman and CEO of Dawson Air, was denied service, had her identity questioned, and was publicly disrespected by employees of her own company at an airport owned by this corporation." No one dared move. Malcolm looked at each person one by one. "Heather Sloan, Trevor King, your names will be addressed in the emergency executive board meeting, starting immediately. I want both of you out of this area in the next 3 minutes. All access privileges are revoked effective now." Heather stammered, You can't just fire me like this. I was only following protocol." Camille spoke then, her voice soft as a breeze but sharp as glass. "If protocol allows for discrimination, then that protocol needs to be burned." Heather said nothing more. Trevor lowered his head, unable to look at anyone. Malcolm signaled. Security stepped forward. 2 guards escorted Heather and Trevor toward the terminal gate, in a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Aisha watched the scene unfold, her hands clutching her shirt, eyes glassy. Camille turned to her and gave a gentle nod. Today, you didn't just witness. You stepped forward. That means more than any system ever could. Once the two were out of sight, Malcolm turned back to Camille. Do you still want to board the plane? Camille shook her head. Not alone. Then she pointed to Aisha. She's coming with me. All eyes turned toward Aisha. She was stunned. I can't. I'm just a contract employee. No, Camille interrupted. From this moment forward, you're with me. You're going to witness every step of the transformation that's coming, from the inside. And in that moment, everything shifted. There were no more mocking smiles, no more dismissive stares. Only one undeniable truth remained. She, the woman once told to wait outside in the rain, was the true owner of everything they had ever believed they controlled. Brookpine Airport was wrapped in a silence that had no name. Not a silence born from a lack of sound, but from the sense that someone had just pulled back the heavy curtain from a stage built on deception, revealing every uncomfortable truth in full light. The rain had stopped, and streaks of pale sunlight were beginning to pierce through the clouds after a long gray day. But no one noticed. Everyone remaining in the VIP area simply stood frozen, holding their breath, unwilling to break the tension hanging between Camille and Malcolm Dawson, the two quiet storm centers now standing fully visible in the open. In Ryan Hughes's hand, the director of security, was a tablet connected to the surveillance hub of the entire airport. He stood next to Malcolm, his face hard as steel, without the slightest tremor of hesitation. All surveillance data from the VIP lounge, the boarding gate, and even the tarmac has been retrieved, Ryan said, eyes fixed on the screen. I've also isolated 3 clips showing clear violations. The moment Trevor refused to verify documents, the moment Heather blocked Ms. Camille from boarding, and the moment she was ordered to wait outside in the rain. Malcolm gave a single nod. Play the first clip. The screen came alive with crisp security footage. The first scene showed the lounge entrance. Camille walked in, presented her elite card and boarding pass. Trevor took them, held them up to the light, frowned, then casually tilted his head toward the door, signaling her to wait outside. No shouting, no arguments. Just a cold act, as clear and sharp as a slap. In the corner of the screen, Aisha Monroe could be seen watching. Nobody said a word. Malcolm gave a hand signal. Ryan moved to the second clip. Camille was standing in the rain. The view was foggy, but clear enough to see she was being denied entry, while 2 white passengers walked in behind her, without questions, without checks, welcomed with smiles. Trevor looked down at the floor, his face burning red. The calm posture he held earlier had collapsed. Around the room, soft murmurs began. Some people stole glances at Camille. Glances that once held doubt or discomfort now shifted into shame, guilt, and a fear that ran deeper than any rulebook. Ryan played the third clip. The footage showed Camille at the bottom of the jet stairs. She presented her documents. Heather crossed her arms and refused. Trevor arrived, not to confirm anything, not to clarify, just to reinforce the order that she leave. Then came the voice. Heather's words rang out clearly. You don't look like the kind of guest we serve. It wasn't screamed. That made it worse. Camille didn't turn her head. She didn't have to. The footage spoke for her. Malcolm looked around the room and said, this wasn't a misunderstanding. These were 3 consecutive actions, systemic ones, demonstrating racial bias, abuse of authority, and the humiliation of Dawson Air's highest-ranking executive. He turned to the HR team. I want the personnel files of Heather Sloan and Trevor King transferred to the disciplinary board immediately. Their system access is already revoked. But we're not finished. He looked back at Ryan. Can you pull the lounge access logs for the last 3 months? I want to see how many people entered without credential checks. Ryan nodded. The fingerprint system and facial recognition software keep detailed logs. I can filter entries by skin tone, gender, and age. Malcolm nodded again. Do it. We're not just dealing with 2 people. We're dealing with the culture that made them. As Ryan began working, a voice spoke from the back. Not loud, but clear enough to cut through the thick air. I'd like to say something. All heads turned. It was Lucas Wells, the ground terminal supervisor, The man who had watched but remained silent. He stepped forward, standing directly in front of Camille. I'm sorry, I saw what happened, and I should have stepped in. But I was afraid. I thought if I interfered, I'd get dragged into trouble. But now, I realize my silence was worse than what they did. Camille looked at him but said nothing. Lucas lowered his head. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just can't stay silent anymore. Malcolm's face was unreadable. He asked, would you be willing to testify formally in front of the executive board? Yes. And are you willing to serve on the internal reform team, help us audit and rebuild the culture of this terminal from the ground up? Lucas swallowed. I'm willing. Malcolm nodded and turned to HR. Noted. Reassign Mr. Wells to the internal audit group for the next 90 days. Camille said nothing, but her expression softened slightly. Aisha stepped forward and gently handed Camille a hot cup of tea she just made. I don't know what to say, but I hope you'll stay, because without you, I'm not sure I want to be here anymore. Camille accepted the tea. Thank you, but don't stay because of me. Stay because you know what's right. She turned to Malcolm. Can we release those videos internally within 24 hours? Malcolm nodded. We can. We'll schedule a company-wide broadcast. Show the entire incident as an unedited case study. Camille placed the cup down. Do it, and don't edit anything. Let everyone see that cruelty doesn't begin with yelling. It begins with a single look of dismissal and a quiet decision made without oversight. And it grows, fed by the silence of bystanders. And then with no speeches, no announcements, no visible signal, Brookpine Airport understood that the old order had collapsed. Not because of a loud rebellion, but because one woman refused to step aside after being humiliated. That was all, but that was enough. The skies above Brookpine darkened once again, as if they too sensed the transformation drawing near. The clouds no longer threatened with thunder, but with a heavy stillness, a silence without wind that still made skin prickle, as if something unseen was quietly circling. Inside the VIP area of the airport, no one dared to move. The remaining staff, from cabin crew to ground personnel, stood frozen, as if caught in a storm whose center none of them had the courage to approach. And at that center stood Camille, the same woman with short curly hair, cold eyes, never raising her voice, no assistant by her side, no visible title, yet no one dared look at her as a mere stranger anymore. On Ryan Hughes's screen, the airport's head of security, the surveillance system showed a convoy passing through the level 3 security gate, heading directly toward the private tarmac. Ryan glanced toward Malcolm, the man standing silently by the glass wall, hand resting lightly on the marble countertop. Eyes sweeping the entire scene like someone calculating the final moves needed to dismantle a cultural rot that had been buried for far too long. They've arrived, Ryan said without turning. Malcolm gave a slight nod. No one heard the engines until the first SUV braked at the edge of the terminal steps. The door opened. Out stepped a woman in a black suit, slim sunglasses and a tight bun. Leona Hart, Dawson Air's chief legal officer. Behind her were 3 senior members of the HR department and a man holding a red-stamped case file. No introductions, no warnings. Her presence alone was enough to signal the company was officially in motion. Malcolm turned, walking straight toward Camille. Are you ready? Camille nodded. You should begin now. Leona stepped forward and opened the file. This is an emergency directive for the immediate review of all personnel involved in today's events. Surveillance and audio evidence have already been submitted to the Operational Oversight System as of noon today. A preliminary review confirms likely violations of our executive service ethics and discrimination policies. Malcolm nodded. Who's at the top of the accountability list? Trevor King and Heather Sloan, Leona replied without glancing at her papers, though it may extend to the regional supervisor if evidence shows awareness without intervention. Malcolm turned toward the remaining staff. Call them here, now. Lucas Wells, the supervisor who had once stayed silent, took a step back. He knew it was his turn. No one scolded him. No one threatened him. But the way Camille's eyes passed over him was enough for Lucas to understand that the way things used to work was over. At that moment, another SUV door opened. Out stepped an elderly man with silver hair, thin but brisk, Eldred James, board member of Dawson Air, the same man who'd signed the approval for the company's first route 27 years ago. His unannounced presence caused the air to thicken. Eldred said nothing at first. He simply shook Camille's hand, then looked around. Can someone explain to me why our CEO was treated like an intruder? No one spoke. He raised his eyebrows. No one. Then what are we running here? An airline or a members-only discrimination club? Malcolm stepped forward. Sir, we've initiated disciplinary protocols. Evidence has been gathered. The individuals in question are either suspended or under review. Eldred stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Good. I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to ensure this company doesn't try to wash away poison with slogans. I want the infection removed at the root. Camille stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but unmistakably clear. And I will personally see to that. Someone exhaled sharply in the background, perhaps a staffer who was only now realizing the scale of this purge. But Camille didn't stop. She looked toward the aircraft steps, where Heather Sloan was being escorted back by security. Though temporarily detained, Heather maintained her composed exterior, but her eyes no longer carried the certainty of someone in control. She repeated one phrase. I followed the protocol. I didn't do anything wrong, Leona answered without blinking. Protocol is not a shield for prejudice. Camille approached and stood directly in front of Heather. No shouting, no accusations, just one quiet question. Do you recognize me now? Heather swallowed hard. Now I do. But you didn't when I stood in the rain, Camille said. And that says everything, Malcolm signaled. The two security staff guided Heather away. She didn't resist. She just bowed her head and walked slowly, as if each step was an unspoken confession. To the left, a compliance officer whispered something to Leona. She turned to Malcolm. We've just found an internal email from Trevor. It was sent to a group he referred to as his trusted circle in the lounge. It contains covert instructions to monitor guests who don't look appropriate. Malcolm clenched his jaw. Immediate termination, no hearing, no negotiation. Camille said nothing, but her eyes now reflected more than disappointment. They held the weary burden of someone who had watched this system fail people like her far too many times, simply because they didn't fit the image that society found acceptable. Eldred James stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. Daughter, don't let them walk away this time. We've stayed quiet far too long. Camille nodded. I won't be quiet anymore. And this time, no one gets to hide. Above them, the last light of afternoon broke through the heavy clouds. A weak beam of sun landed directly on the steps of the Falcon LX, as if marking the beginning of a new journey. Not one in the skies, but right here on the ground, where a woman once told to wait outside in the rain was now rewriting the rules for an entire system that once believed it never needed to change. The Falcon 60 stood silent on the tarmac, like a steel-winged giant awaiting clearance for flight. The last traces of rain had dried from its body, reflecting the fading sunset that slid across the concrete as if even nature itself was waiting for a worthy conclusion. The boarding gate area had been temporarily cordoned off for internal procedures. All remaining passengers were moved to an adjacent lounge for privacy. Yet inside the luxurious space, no one looked comfortable. They whispered, avoided eye contact. The tension wasn't from waiting, it came from something more primal. They had just witnessed something far beyond an internal review. It was a collapse of order, and they were far too close to the epicenter. Camille remained at the foot of the plane, the same aircraft she had been denied boarding just hours earlier. Her gaze was fixed on the metal staircase, once a site of suspicion and challenge to her very identity, now standing as a symbol of quiet but profound justice. Malcolm Dawson stepped forward, his suit now faintly marked by moisture, though it did nothing to diminish his air of command. We're ready, he said. Camille nodded. But I want one thing confirmed before we take off. What's that? None of the people who enabled, covered up, or looked down on others will be joining this flight. Not a single one. Malcolm didn't ask for clarification. He simply turned and signaled to Leona Hart, the company's chief legal officer, standing near the window. Leona nodded, pulled out her phone, and made a brief internal call. Minutes later, 4 names were removed from the boarding manifest. One name surprised everyone. Mark Ellison, regional PR director, who hadn't been present during the incident, but had sent an internal email defending Heather minutes after the footage had surfaced. "He's not physically here," Leona said, "but that email makes his stance clear." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Leave him behind and schedule an internal hearing." Leona turned to Camille. "Is there anyone else you'd like removed?" Camille paused. Then she said one final name: Patricia North, Heather's manager, who had submitted a graduation-level evaluation for Heather 2 months ago, despite quiet concerns raised by junior staff. Leona raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "I'll update the list." From afar, a group of airport personnel began preparing the gate. But this time, they weren't moving with the usual mechanical urgency. They moved cautiously, almost nervously. A few avoided making eye contact with Camille, even if they hadn't been involved. The truth was, the entire terminal was silently auditing itself. Camille walked toward the stairs, but she wasn't going alone. Aisha Monroe, the young staffer who had stood by Camille from the very beginning, had been summoned under special order. Malcolm approached her. "We want you to board with us, not because of your title, but because your values deserve a seat at that table." Aisha stood frozen. "I don't know what to say." Camille looked at her. "Then stay silent and walk, like you did when you stood beside me. Silent, but not invisible." Aisha nodded, eyes brimming. She followed Camille up the stairs. But one person remained behind: Lucas Wells. He hadn't been blacklisted, but he hadn't been invited either. He stood still, watching. Camille turned back toward him. "You spoke up, but for most of the time you didn't." Lucas nodded. "I know. You're not coming on this flight," Camille said gently. "But if you truly want to make it right, start with the next one, not in the sky, but on the ground." Lucas said nothing, but he bowed, not in shame, but in acknowledgement that he'd just been handed a second chance. The cabin door opened. Malcolm stood at the top of the steps and extended a hand toward Camille. "Ready?" Camille nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. She ascended. Each step was an answer to those who had once doubted her. She wasn't angry, but she would not forget, and she would never let it happen again. Once the group had entered the cabin, the aircraft door sealed shut. A soft click echoed. But to those still on the tarmac, it sounded like the closing of an entire chapter. In the control room, the signal light blinked. The pilot requested clearance. Tower approved. The Falcon 60 began to roll forward. Camille looked out the window, not searching for anyone, not turning back. But in that moment, Brookpine Terminal was no longer the place that had cast her out. It had become the beginning of something else. A reminder that every great shift often starts with one small moment of quiet humiliation. And perhaps the most important truth of all, this time, the plane took off without the people who once thought they got to decide who belonged on board. The Falcon LX had pierced through the last layers of thin afternoon clouds, leaving behind not just an airport caught between embarrassment and awakening, but also a system once proud to believe it was already good enough. But no one on that flight believed a single phone call was enough to clean everything up. Camille sat quietly by the window, the soft cabin lights reflecting off her cheek. Across the aisle, Aisha was intently reading a file Malcolm had just handed her. Inside were not financial reports or expansion plans, but case files of employees previously flagged for disrespect, bias, or manipulative HR practices, all of which had been dismissed for being not serious enough. "Why are there so many?" Aisha murmured. Malcolm, seated opposite her, didn't even look up. "Because people don't think small things are problems, not until they happen to someone powerful enough not to ignore them." Camille turned, her expression serious but not cold. "It's not just about power. It's about being someone who refuses to forget." In the rear cabin, Leona Hart was coordinating the HR and legal teams remotely via secure connection. The list of suspended personnel had reached 23, ranging from frontline staff to an entire regional training lead. Among them, 6 had previously been reported, but never disciplined. Leona looked up toward Malcolm. "Do you want me to include those who haven't committed clear violations but show negative patterns?" Malcolm looked at Camille. She nodded. "Give them a choice. Rewrite a new ethical commitment and attend a special retraining program, or voluntarily resign with standard severance." Leona typed quickly. "I'll draft the pledge agreement." What about the retraining program? Camille answered without pause. I'll teach the first session myself. The cabin went silent for a few seconds. Then Malcolm let out a quiet laugh. Well, there go a few peaceful nights. But none of them knew that back at Brookpine Terminal, where it all began, the first aftershocks were already spreading like underground tremors. 90 minutes after the Falcon took off, a short surveillance clip was leaked to Dawson Air's internal employee forum. The video showed Camille at the jet staircase, soaked by rain, being coldly denied boarding. No insults were spoken, no one yelled. But the coldness and the look of doubt was enough to make hundreds of employees watching online pause. Within 15 minutes, the video was re-uploaded into 3 private social groups for cabin crew and ground staff. It carried one caption: "What if the woman you ignored was the one who hired your boss?" A simple question, but razor sharp. Comments began to appear. Some defended, some deflected, but most remained silent. That silence was a symptom of what Camille once described to the executive board as the quiet disease, a collective culture of ignoring small wrongs out of fear, comfort, or convenience. But Camille was no longer willing to accept that. At Dawson Air headquarters in Denver, the large electronic board in the main hall updated at exactly 8:07 p.m. Executive Statement: Launching the Service Culture Rebuild Initiative, Code 08-DG-RX. Below it, in smaller letters, "We don't fix wrongs with apologies. We fix them by not repeating them." A new motto written by Camille herself. Just 12 words. But she knew it would force every department to reassess how they interact, evaluate, hire, and train. The next morning, a nationwide online meeting was scheduled. But this time, it wasn't just for senior management. Camille had insisted it be open to all frontline employees. Her reason: because mistakes begin exactly where we think no one's watching. Mid-flight, Leona received an update. 3 managers had resigned overnight following the video leak. One was the head of customer service in Chicago. Another had approved Heather's HR evaluation the previous year. The third was Trevor's assistant, fired on the spot. Camille wasn't surprised. She knew that when systems begin to purge themselves, the first to go are those who once benefited most from silence. But she didn't feel triumphant. She knew that anyone who had ever stayed silent, including herself, shared some part of the blame. She wasn't here to get revenge. She was here to rebuild. And rebuilding didn't start with the termination list. It started with the list of those who stayed and were brave enough to cross the line from passive to principled. Malcolm stood up and poured Camille a glass of water. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when an internal review turned into a full-scale transformation." Camille took the glass, her eyes still on the window. "We don't need a storm to wash everything clean. We just need enough people willing to wipe away the stains one by one." Malcolm nodded. "And you'll be the first one holding the cloth." Camille didn't answer, but for the first time since the flight began, her expression softened. Not out of weakness, but because she knew, this time, she wasn't alone anymore. The first morning light sliced into the cabin like a soft blade, cutting through the final remnants of night. On the display panel overhead, the words "Estimated Arrival, 7:18 a.m. Seattle," blinked gently. But for those seated in the main cabin, this journey was no longer about geography. It had become a journey inward. Aisha sat upright, no longer the hesitant new hire who once shrank under Heather's scolding gaze. The night before, after the aircraft had stabilized in the sky, she had been invited by Malcolm and Camille to the rear cabin. Not as an employee, but as someone who had witnessed long enough to know what needed to change. "What do you think made all this last for so long?" Camille had asked. Aisha had replied with a single sentence: "Because everyone thought they were too small to do anything." But now, as she looked through the window and saw the distant Cascade Mountains, she understood. Sometimes that smallness was nothing more than the way systems taught people to forget that courage doesn't need a permission slip. Malcolm approached and handed her a small device. "This morning, you'll be the opening speaker for the national employee meeting." Aisha froze. "Me? Why me?" Camille stood just behind him, her expression gentle but firm. "Because you stood up when no one else did. Not to fight someone, but to stand for something right." Aisha took the device. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't refuse. She only nodded, slowly, deliberately, like someone finally stepping into their own name. At the rear of the cabin, Lucas Wells sat with his fingers interlocked. He had barely slept. Every moment, every phrase he had let slide, every offhand remark, every dismissive glance he never challenged, played in his mind like a film with no pause button. He knew he hadn't committed any direct harm, but he also knew his silence, his so-called neutrality, had been the loudest sin of all. And he also knew no one was asking him to repent publicly. But Camille had once said something that haunted him. Justice doesn't need an apology. It needs an action that no apology can replace. So as the plane began its descent, Lucas pulled out his phone and opened the company's internal app, where thousands of employees had been following updates from the Brookpine event. He tapped New Post. Then he began to type. No flowery language, no tearful regret, just the truth. That he had sat through trainings where instructors casually claimed black customers were twice as difficult. That he had heard colleagues joke behind a new hire's back, saying, "He won't last 3 months. Look at him." That he had watched a team leader tell a young female flight attendant, "If you want to move up, you should wear brighter makeup." And that he had done nothing. At the end, Lucas wrote one final line. "I didn't speak up when it mattered. I'm speaking now, not to be forgiven, but so no one else has to wait to tell the truth." He hit post. Then he powered off the phone, not expecting praise, not seeking redemption, just hoping not to repeat the same silence. As the plane landed, an urgent internal memo was issued by the communications team. Post by Lucas Wells marked as spotlight feature for the next 24 hours for system-wide employee discussion. A few senior managers were uneasy. Some argued the post could be misinterpreted and harm brand perception. But Camille said only one thing. If our brand can't survive a truth written with courage, then it's not a brand worth protecting. Meanwhile, at headquarters in Denver, where the nationwide Zoom meeting was being prepped, Aisha entered the broadcast studio. She wore a plain white blouse, no logos, no branding. She held the mic, no teleprompter, no script. She simply spoke. "My name is Aisha Monroe. I'm not a leader. I'm not a spokesperson. I'm just someone who used to fear silence more than saying the wrong thing. But that day I saw a woman turned away at a gate because someone decided she didn't belong there. And I realized, if I didn't stand up, then someday I might be the one pushed out. Not because I did something wrong, but because no one remembered what right looked like." Thousands of employees were watching across America, from Atlanta to Denver, from San Diego to Boston. She continued, "I'm not asking us to stand against anyone. I just want each of us to have the courage to face the places where kindness became a luxury, and to start, from the smallest place, ourselves." The entire meeting fell silent. No one unmuted to speak, but in the chat window, hundreds of messages poured in. "Thank you. I've been there too. I'm starting over today." After her speech, Aisha stepped off stage and walked toward the door. Camille was waiting. She didn't offer praise. She just gently took Aisha's hand. "You don't need to lead to show people the way." Aisha smiled, the kind of smile that comes from someone who's just learned that bravery doesn't need a title. It only needs one moment, one stance, at the right time, and the will not to step back. And behind her, Lucas stepped forward, careful to avoid the camera. He spoke softly to Aisha. "Thank you for doing what I was afraid to do." Aisha looked at him, without judgment. "Then you already know what to do now." Lucas nodded. "Next time, I won't need someone else to lead the way." The atmosphere inside Dawson Air's Denver headquarters on Monday morning felt like a thunderstorm that hadn't broken yet. No one was running, no one was shouting, but every step, every door opening and closing, carried a quiet weight, as if the entire building was bracing for a battlefield without smoke. Camille wasn't wearing a blazer. She had chosen a charcoal gray dress with a high collar and no branding. Not because she was avoiding attention, but because today, every message needed to come from action, not symbols. When she entered the 14th floor conference room, all the senior department heads were already seated. Some of them had once accused her of being too emotional in how she handled the Brookpine incident. Some had even suggested she be temporarily removed from the CEO position, pending an internal investigation. But today, no one spoke. Camille didn't sit down. She stood at the front of the room, near the large screen. No slides, no presentations, just her voice. "I'm not here to defend my decisions," she said. "I'm here to invite each of you to help decide what the future of Dawson Air should be." A few exchanged glances, but no one objected. She continued, "If we were only here to fire a few people, write a few apologies, and publish a few updated policies, I wouldn't have asked you to show up this morning. I could have done that alone. But I don't want to rebuild something that once collapsed right in front of me while I stayed silent." She turned to the screen behind her. The words appeared in bold white font, REDAWSON. A hand went up. "Is that the name of a new campaign?" someone asked. Camille nodded. "It's not a campaign. It's how we rebuild ourselves. I don't want an improvement. I want a rebirth." Now she had their full attention. Camille then introduced the 3 pillars of Dawson: radical listening, listening all the way down to the root; embodied ethics, creating mechanisms so ethics become behavior, not slogans; transparent power, making every layer of authority and feedback visible. No one argued, but one regional director raised a question: how do we measure things like ethics or listening? Camille didn't dodge it. "We'll measure them by the courage of those who speak and by how we respond. If an employee sends a report and gets terminated within 3 months, we'll audit the entire chain of response. No more coincidences will be allowed." At that moment, Malcolm Dawson entered the room. Everyone turned. Though he had been retired for nearly 3 years, his name still anchored the identity of the brand. Malcolm didn't say much. He handed Camille a single sheet of paper, a copy of the internal code of ethics he personally wrote in 1993, now updated with one new clause added: "The right of a person is to be treated as though they matter, even if they mean nothing to you." The room fell silent, not out of fear, but because, for the first time, they realized this wasn't a PR incident. This was a value system overhaul, from the root. A member of the legal committee raised their hand. If Dawson is implemented, the anonymous reporting system will need to expand. Even executives will need to be reviewed from the bottom up. Are you willing to be the first one evaluated? Camille didn't blink. "I'm requesting to be the first." She turned to look at Malcolm. "If I can't uphold it, you have every right to revoke my mandate." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Camille, you don't need permission to do what's right, but you must ensure no one is left behind if they're willing to relearn." Camille turned back to the room. "Starting next month, the entire organization will have a no silence day, one day every month when any employee can submit feedback, ideas, or criticism without approval. All of it will be compiled and responded to publicly." One HR executive looked uneasy. "That could get chaotic." Camille's eyes didn't waver. "Chaos is when we don't know what people think. Transparency is never chaos. It's just inconvenient for those used to hiding." Her words moved through the room like a current, but no one interrupted. No one walked out, because deep down they knew Camille wasn't threatening anyone. She was reclaiming what should have been the foundation of this company all along. After the meeting, Camille didn't return to her office. She went straight down to the main floor, where more than 200 corporate employees were working. No announcement, no security, no media. She walked between desks, asking each person a single question. "If I could change one thing about how Dawson Air operates, what would you want me to change?" Some hesitated, some chuckled, some teared up, and some didn't say anything. Just reached for her hand and nodded. Malcolm watched from a distance. He didn't follow. He simply observed, then turned away. Before he left the building, he left a handwritten note at the front desk. It said only one line: "Camille isn't rebuilding Dawson Air. She's rebuilding decency from a place people once thought was the last place to find it." On a quiet Thursday morning, the HR department at the Brookpine branch received an unmarked envelope delivered by hand. It hadn't been routed through the internal system, bore no postal code, only a line written in pale purple ink. "To Camille for what it's worth." The receptionist initially assumed it was a routine suggestion letter, but upon opening it, they froze. The letter was signed at the bottom by Heather Sloan. 3 weeks earlier, Heather's name had sent social media into a frenzy after her discriminatory and demeaning treatment of a black woman, without knowing that woman was the CEO of the very company she worked for. Heather had once been one of Brookpine's top performers, praised for efficiency, high customer service ratings. But she was also the one who uttered the words steeped in bias. People like you don't belong in places like this. After the incident, Heather disappeared. No interviews, no internal memos. Rumors swirled that she had resigned, left the industry, or moved cities. But no one knew for sure until the letter appeared. Camille didn't read it alone. She opened it in front of the entire new leadership team at Brookpine, including Aisha, Lucas, and several newly promoted employees from previously overlooked departments. The letter didn't begin with an apology. It began with a question. How many times in my life have I said things that made others feel smaller, just to make myself feel bigger? Heather recounted her story, a child raised in a conservative household where service was ranked. White customers were prioritized. Others were told to be patient. She wrote, I was taught how to be polite, but never how to be fair. She didn't blame her upbringing. On the contrary, she confessed, I chose silence every time a colleague said something wrong. I chose complicity because it made me feel safe. And then Heather described the moment that changed her. Not the suspension, not the news coverage, but the moment she watched the security footage, the moment Camille looked directly at her, said nothing, didn't protest, just looked, as if she had seen this happen too many times to be shocked anymore. Heather wrote, that look made me feel more ashamed than any reprimand could, because it wasn't filled with anger. It carried something heavier, a disappointment that no longer expected repair. She shared that in the 3 weeks following the incident, she lived in a state of emptiness, not because she lost her job, but because, for the first time in her life, she no longer believed in the version of herself she had built. One morning, while passing a gas station, she saw a middle-aged attendant cleaning a public restroom. The woman smiled and nodded at everyone, even those who didn't acknowledge her. Heather paused, bought a coffee, and returned to ask, how do you manage to stay cheerful every day? The woman simply smiled, because I know kindness is the only thing people can't take from me unless I let them. Heather said nothing, but a thought struck her. She had let others take kindness from her because she believed power was about pushing others down. From that day, Heather began to rewrite every action that had made her feel ashamed. She kept a journal. Each page detailed a moment, a comment she had made, a glance she had ignored, a colleague she had looked down upon. By the 48th page, her hands began to shake. And then she wrote the letter to Camille. In it, she didn't ask to return, didn't seek forgiveness. She simply hoped that this letter, if read, can be proof that I do not wish to walk forward as if the past never happened. Camille finished reading without a word. She passed the letter to Aisha. Aisha read it, bit her lip gently, then said, if someone like her has the courage to write this, then maybe someone like me must have the courage to believe people can change. Lucas suggested, we should include this letter in the internal newsletter, but along with responses from those she once hurt, not to condemn, but to balance the narrative. Camille agreed. A week later, a special issue of Dawson Air's internal newsletter was published. Title, Letters We Never Expected and Answers We Still Need. It included Heather's full letter and honest responses from staff. I'm not sure I've forgiven her, but I see she's starting over, and I respect that. I used to fear running into Heather. Now I fear becoming her, if I keep staying silent. I don't need her to be fired. I need her to understand. And it seems she does. Camille wrote the closing note for the newsletter. We're not building a perfect company. We're building one that knows when to pause, apologize, and begin again. Together. From that, a new internal training program was formed, not labeled diversity or inclusion as usual, but called the Mirror Room, the spaces where we see ourselves again. And in a training room at Dawson Air's new branch, Heather Sloan, under the title of Voluntary Training Advisor, sat quietly in the back of the room. She didn't teach. She didn't lecture. She listened, took notes, and learned as if she were entirely new. One trainee approached and whispered, "Are you?" Heather looked up, not ashamed, not proud. She just nodded. I used to be the person you think can't change. The trainee didn't react, just said, good, because I want to believe I can still change too, before I become someone like that. On September 5th, a special hearing was held in Washington, D.C., under the supervision of the Committee on Ethics and Justice in Air Service. For the first time in 17 years, an airline CEO was invited to testify not because of a lawsuit, but because she had been recommended as a case study in industry-wide reform. Camille appeared without a legal team, no attorneys by her side, only a cream-colored envelope in her hand, containing handwritten notes she had compiled over the past 3 weeks. Across from her sat not just politicians. They were a collection of former complainants, airline workers who had faced discrimination, and ethics scholars in customer service. When her turn came, Camille didn't rise immediately. She sat still for a moment, then slowly walked to the podium. I'm not here to defend my brand, she began, her voice low and steady. I'm here to tell a story. She spoke of Brookpine, not as a PR incident, but as a moment of awakening. She spoke about Heather Sloan, by her real name, without deflection. She spoke of the surveillance cameras that didn't capture looks, but did capture apathy. And then she opened the envelope, pulled out a photograph. It was a still from a security camera. The moment Aisha turned away, shoulders slumped after being dismissed. This was the moment a customer wasn't just denied service. It was the moment a human being was told their presence was discomforting. She paused. The room was silent. She continued. But this, she pulled out another photo, is Aisha, 2 weeks later, leading an internal training for Dawson Air's entire frontline staff. The photo isn't high resolution, but her eyes say more than any internal policy we've ever written. One committee member asked, so how is Dawson Air different now from 3 months ago? Camille did not hesitate. We don't claim to be better. We just make sure people are seen before they're judged. Another asked, do you think fairness can be systematized? Camille replied, it can't, but we can systematize not ignoring injustice. The hearing lasted 47 minutes, but a 3-minute clip of Camille's testimony was shared over 11 million times in the first week. The most popular caption read, she didn't appeal to sympathy, she redesigned dignity. A week later, the committee issued its preliminary recommendation. Dawson Air would serve as the pilot organization for implementing the CARE protocol, a new standard requiring all airlines to make public their procedures for addressing and responding to discriminatory behavior. In a separate development, the U.S. Department of Transportation appointed Camille to its advisory panel for the Equity in Transit 2030 strategy as an independent voice. But Camille didn't accept immediately. She left D.C. in silence. No press conference. No victory speech. She returned to Brookpine, where it all began. There, she didn't go to the executive offices. She went to the lounge, the place where someone had once told her she shouldn't be here. Now a small plaque on the wall read, this space was once closed off. Now it is open to every guest with dignity. Camille sat in the same chair she had once been denied. Across from her sat Aisha, now in a new uniform, no longer traditional white, but a deep navy purple, the color of healing. Aisha said nothing. She simply placed a cup of peppermint tea in front of Camille, the kind she had once requested and been refused. I got the flavor right today, Aisha whispered. Camille nodded, her eyes glistening, not because of the tea, but because silence no longer carried the same weight it once did. Overhead, the new lighting system cast a faint reflection of words etched into the ceiling. Dignity is not a favor. It's a foundation. A young boy walking by glanced at Camille and asked his mother, Mom, is that the lady who fixed the airport? Camille didn't answer. The mother smiled. No, sweetie. She's the one who reminded them not to let it break again. In the next quarter's internal handbook, Camille wrote a single line. Not as a CEO, but as someone who had once endured quietly. I'm not leaving behind a brand. I'm leaving behind a slower rhythm, so each of us can look more carefully, listen a little longer, and walk farther together. The story didn't close with a ceremony, not with a nameplate, but with the exchanged looks between those who had once stayed silent and who now at last began to speak. And somewhere in Dawson Air's year-end newsletter, There was a photo of a new wall installed at the entrance of Brookpine Terminal. On it, not a logo, not a slogan, but 7 words embossed in both print and braille. We see you. We hear you. Always. And if you still remember the look in Camille's eyes the first time she was told to leave the lounge, then remember too how she walked out of that hearing room, not with anger, not needing applause, but with the quiet belief that justice doesn't have to be loud. It just needs someone brave enough to begin. This story isn't about a CEO. It's about every one of us when we choose not to stay silent in the face of erasure. If you've ever been misjudged because of how you look, what you do, or the color of your skin, let this story remind you, you don't need to be famous to create change. You just need to speak up. We share this story not to condemn anyone, but to shine a light on the dignity of those who were once forgotten. Leave us a comment below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment like this? What would you do if kindness was disrespected right in front of you? And if you believe in stories like this, the kind that make you angry, make you tear up, but leave you with hope, hit subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Because the world needs more people who are willing to listen and brave enough to tell the story.